Hello, today we're speaking with Derin Alemli, COO of New Age Meats. Welcome to the podcast, Derin.
Thank you so much, James.
Fantastic. To start, could you tell us a little bit about New Age Meats?
Yeah, New Age Meats is a cultivated pork company based in Berkeley, California. We are working on growing pork cells using a biological process to create a more sustainable ecosystem for pork products. That is our first meat, but we're certainly looking to tackle this as more of a broader initiative to help the environment.
And so was the kind of original kind of impact or the kind of concept around the company sustainability first, or, a lot of companies who are focused on cellular agriculture are often coming from an animal cruelty point of view? Which was the kind of core mission of the company?
I think it is definitely more towards sustainability. I think there's kind of two facets, right? So from its genesis, our CEO, Brian Spears, was himself a vegetarian, and animal cruelty is a big factor to him. But as the company has developed, we found that, from a consumer standpoint, the animal cruelty side is not nearly as important to the sustainability piece as is the environmental impact and, all of those components. So I would say sustainability is definitely a bigger focus for us overall.
And so in general, how open are consumers to cellular meat and kind of similar products?
Our research has shown that, and I should say our research and the industry's research as a whole has shown that they are open to it, but certainly there is a consumer education piece that needs to come along with that. So proving safety and efficacy is definitely something that's in our roadmap for sure.
And I suppose, what are the kind of ways that a company like yourselves or the industry kind of as a whole can do that? Is that primarily marketing? Is that working with regulatory bodies? A combination of both?
We're sort of viewing it as a three-pronged approach, if you will. So on the one hand, you're going to have to go through the regulatory channels, and certainly getting that validation will be key to showing consumer response. But then, I think there's a demonstration factor that will have to be sort of shown to people. And that may be some through influencing and other channels. But then finally, of course, there's a true marketing component. So really putting marketing dollars behind it, getting industry write-ups, press coverage, and things like that.
And so I believe pork sausage is your kind of first product. What kind of drove that decision for that to be the first product?
Well, I think if you back it up from a science perspective, we felt that pork was a highly researched animal, and that because of that, we could move faster in the science, and especially in a very nascent technology like this, while some of the potentially highest value products would be very intriguing, they could also be some of the more difficult. And that could mean a much longer product development cycle. And in any sort of biotechnology, that could mean the difference between a couple of years and, a decade. And from our perspective, waiting that long to get to market was simply not something that we were interested in. Then marrying that of a capability standpoint to a market standpoint, pork is one of the most highly consumed animals in the world. And, there's a huge market for it for a variety of reasons. But then drilling down to what we're capable of today, a mincemeat variety or a sausage is definitely one of the easier products to create from scratch, whereas we are definitely interested in getting more towards whole tissue products like a bacon or a pork belly. From an immediate standpoint, producing a pork sausage is the path of least resistance to get us to market.
Yeah, I mean, sausage, so I'm from Ireland originally, and the kind of classic Irish breakfast food is the pork sausage. Mm-hmm. And I actually, I think any Irish person or anybody who's lived in Ireland will remember this, but there was actually this very famous pork sausage brand called Galty, and they had this classic advertisement of it, like an Irishman in the middle of the night cooking sausages at like 3 a.m. and his American wife comes in and it's like, Sean, why are you cooking sausages so early? It's like 3 a.m. And he says, but it's breakfast time back home. Mm-hmm. And so there's like relationship between mm-hmm. like the pork mm-hmm. sausage and those kind of cultural cues, which maybe, I suppose, somewhat unique to some countries, but definitely kind of rings home for me.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And then in terms of, one of the, I think, really interesting aspects of New Age Meats is this combination of cellular meat with plant-based technologies and as part of the finalized product. Just what drove that kind of combination? A lot of other companies are just going full-on cellular meat or full-on plant-based alternatives. So yeah, could you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think if you're talking first probably about the plant-based alternatives out there, there's certainly a huge and growing market there, but in the sausage category alone, plant-based sausages are a mere $50 million relative to a $7.5 billion pork sausage market. So it's just a drop in the bucket thus far. Those plant-based alternatives can definitely get very close towards what is really replicating the existing taste of pork and what a pork sausage and why, and really reflecting all those reasons why we like to eat pork sausage. There's a certain experience to it that we're trying to replicate, and plant-based alternatives can get close, but they can't fully get there. It's like really sort of an asymptotic approach to that limit. So what we then see is, okay, well, if we want to fully replicate that item, you could go the route of growing all the cells specifically. However, that is still a very expensive endeavor. Don't want to necessarily get into cost per pound right now, but it is very expensive. And I think that if you're going for a approach that fully replicated each part of that muscle, fat, and connective tissue, you would be waiting a very long time to be getting to a cost competitive standpoint. So what we're sort of focused on is what's the least amount of these cultivated cells we can add to a product to provide all the flavor experiences and all the sensory characteristics that people are used to, but at a price that we're able to get to market with. And so that's really what drove that decision to approach with a blended product. As a lot of our competitors in the cultivated space are really interested in a 100% cultivated product, and we think we would like to get there as well one day. But the time it will take to bring those costs into line are definitely much farther out than we can get with just a sort of blended product.
And so, because you mentioned timing, I suppose what are your kind of current timings, and how much of those are based on your own kind of technological development versus other things like FDA approval, et cetera?
Sure. I don't want to get too into the weeds on our timing, as I will then be held to that. But
Sure.
I would say within the next couple of years, all the sort of paths that we're looking at will sort of be working in parallel. So there is our own technological capabilities, there is marketing, consumer acceptance, and getting our brand out there. And then, of course, the regulatory aspects. But the plan would sort of be to work in parallel between all those.
And because you mentioned brand, so the idea right now is to build your own brand rather than be a supplier of the raw materials to other brands.
That is the idea, yeah. We see that there's a huge value stack there, and that end piece of the consumer product is extremely valuable. If there does come a time later that a larger player feels that we could be better aligned in their larger portfolio, it's certainly a conversation we're open to having. But the main goal thus far is to really create a consumer brand that people can trust because of our safety and quality.
And so one of the aspects, a different, I suppose, approach to the timing is, if you are to create a pork sausage, in the traditional manner, you have to raise a pig, you have to bring it through, a particular life cycle, shorter than we'd all like, I'm sure. And then you have to go through a kind of a meat processing step, produce the sausage, get it to shelves. Often meat has to hang for a certain amount of time, all this kind of thing. And so it can take, probably the guts of a year or maybe a little bit less from, birth to a pork sausage. In terms of, let's say, the potential production for the products you're talking about, how does that compare just in a timing to, from beginning to end in terms of workflow process?
I mean, I should say that we're still working on building up our scale, so I don't necessarily have verified figures for a scaled production, but I can tell you what we estimate. Roughly from sort of the start to finish, the idea is you'll start at a much smaller quantity of a bioreactor, and so that might be just a liter, and then ultimately you'll build that up to traditional biopharma stir tank reactors, get up to 10, 20,000, 50,000 liters, so building up that scale. It can take anywhere up to 2 months to build up to that higher tier, but then you harvest from that larger bioreactor. And ideally, if your yields are working properly, you can be harvesting multiple pigs out of the equivalent of multiple pigs out of that, and result in the matter of a couple of months.
Understood. And in terms of like nutritional value and also kind of flavor profile, one of the critiques of the plant-based or the fully plant-based solution in the past has been there's a fairly large amount of sodium in a lot of those products to kind of bring it up to a certain kind of meat-like texture and flavor. I suppose, has there been any kind of internal research on, how close or different the kind of end nutritional value or, even the taste profile of your products will look like?
So as I was stating previously, is that when you look at some of those plant-based options, they're using a plant-based toolkit in order to try to answer these questions of how can you make these plants taste like meat. And in so doing, they often have to add a lot of additives that just simply aren't trustworthy, or add a lot of those negative nutritional pieces that you're referring to there. I think what's really key about our process is, instead of trying to add certain oils and gums and things like that, we're really just adding cultivated meat, which is real meat. I mean, it's the same on a cellular basis. In that way, we sort of skirt some of those issues that might add a lot of those negative externalities. And in fact, something we're going to be continuing to research is, are we able to consistently add even more of the good things that we want out of that? So could there be more of certain vitamins or more omega-3 fatty acids or things like that we can add into the process? As it looks right now on our initial tests, we're, ounce for ounce, very comparable to conventional pork sausage. And, as a was saying, can hopefully be even adding some more of the good kinds of nutritional items that you would want.
And the original source of the stem cells, I think I saw on your website that, they were coming from a specific kind of cruelty-free kind of source. Once you sourced once, is that basically the entire cell line you'll ever need, or are you continuously kind of looking for other potential cell lines to use as you kind of evolve, your product direction?
It's mostly optimized at that point, so you're not going to have to go back to that well regularly to get new cells to grow. Now, we may continue to do that for other animals, or if we're trying to understand potentially new characteristics, as once you take that cell from biopsy from a living pig, there you do have to perform some adjustments to it at a sort of bench scale biological level. And once you sort of do that, you do lose sort of the initial imprint. So occasionally we may look to go back to get other pig cells, but for the most part, the downstream process is sort of handled at that point. And as much as possible, we try to do that process in a cruelty-free way, putting anesthesia onto a pig and making sure that it's a live pig and not slaughtered in any way.
And so I was recently talking to somebody from Future Fields, and they're primarily focused on bringing down the cost of the medium that cellular meat is grown in. I just wanted to kind of get a sense, is that, a large, like the bulk of the cost for the cellular meat that you are also kind of working on, the medium that it's grown in? And are there kind of ways that you can kind of internally kind of reduce that cost?
Yeah, it is a huge driver of the cost. Probably, a great majority of it is this media, the growth factors that you need to feed these cells in order to allow them to grow. I mean, just like humans or any animal, the cells need food and calories to grow and create, divide and create more cells. What I think is really interesting about that market, though, is that there's a whole cottage industry now springing up around trying to address this market of cultivated meat in a way that otherwise hadn't really been there before. Future Fields is a great example. So these growth factors had existed in a medical application for a long time, but the needs for cultivated meat are definitely different. So Future Fields being a great example of how they're seeking to develop new growth factors, but there are a whole bunch of other companies trying to find new and unique ways to create these growth factors. And we're definitely, us and everyone in the industry really is going to be benefiting from these reduced costs, because otherwise reduced costs weren't really a factor in the biopharm industry before. Now, that being said, as those costs are reduced, there's certainly items that we are working on internally that I can't speak too highly of, but essentially are related to just increasing the efficiency of how our process runs, and increasing the yield, so that if, say, a certain amount of growth factors today can produce 1 pound of cultivated meat, ideally over time that can produce 2, 3, or 4 pounds for that same amount of input.
You mentioned, this kind of industry that's growing up, or these different types of players that are growing up around the industry. How do you think about the competitive landscape? So obviously you do have other cellular meat-focused companies, you have plant-based meat companies, but you also have that kind of massive, $7 billion alone in pork sausage market. Who do you think of as your kind of primary competitors? Are they like the established kind of meat processors, or are you more thinking about the other kind of startups in the space?
Well, I mean, I guess there's sort of short term and long term, right? So long term, I think we're competing with any other protein provider, whether that's cultivated, plant based, or conventional meat. And so, making the best possible products at a price that is sustainable and not so out of whack with what existing prices are for those other options is definitely the main goal around how we're going to build ourselves into a large brand. In the short term, I think there is some, notoriety factors within cultivated meat specifically. There's plenty of other companies that are all, and we have great respect for a lot of the other companies in our space. But I think we're taking a little bit of a different approach. We are definitely focused more on the market-based reception of it, and I think we're not going to strive for 100% cultivated product like others will. And so I think that is definitely a differentiator of ours, is really focusing on that downstream product, looking at a high volume solution, and trying to make meat for the masses and not just an expensive luxury good that can over time start to decrease in price.
And one of the kind of core elements you mentioned earlier was this kind of sustainability. I think a lot of people more and more people at least are familiar with the idea of, cow farts and burps being kind of a major methane driver of global emissions. I suppose internally, like, how do you kind of think about the potential kind of emissions avoided of the kind of your kind of products versus, the traditional kind of meat industry?
Yeah, there is a lot more study that we want to perform on this, especially as our ultimate at scale process is not fully defined yet. But from a carbon perspective, the reason that a lot of us are in this, our CEO especially, and myself included, is we see climate change as an existential threat to our environment, to our existence as humans, really. So in that sense, we will always be looking at ways that as we continue to scale, that we can be at the very least offsetting our carbon emissions or providing other renewable energy into the system to offset our consumption. And then there's resource drain as well. So to the extent that we can be recycling water or any other sort of resources that we're drawing in to create these products, that's extremely important to us.
And so is that kind of the potential for like an internal team, or are there kind of products or services that you're already utilizing to kind of track that information?
I guess in that sense, we're planning a lot of it at the moment. Our next, theoretically, our next phase will be more towards looking at, facilities of a larger scale. We've already had conversations with energy providers and things like that about how we can kind of budget that in to eventual facilities. But, there's continued progress that needs to be made on both internally and, externally with capital raising and all that sort of stuff.
And what are the aspects of the food supply chain that cause a huge amount of emissions is just pure kind of food waste? You have, I guess, again, in the kind of pork supply chain, you might have things kept at the wrong temperature and kind of go off and all that kind of thing. How do you think about overproduction of food and also food waste in total, and how something like what you're working on could potentially impact that?
Well, I mean, I think that's definitely a different question. I think the conventional meat industry has a variety of waste that they provide or create just because of the nature of you're taking an animal that invariably has a lot of pieces that you do or do not need or need at various levels. And there's a lot of other things that go through that process that, are going to create, whether it's a bad batch or contamination or anything like that, our sorts of processes are just not going to have in them. So we're not going to have to worry about, carcasses and disposing of that sort of stuff. And then, by the ability to be sort of more of a just-in-time production facility, we can also sort of balance the eventual flow to market in a way that, some conventional farmers, if they have too much of a product and there's an overflow, they can't get to market. There was, in fact, during the COVID crisis, especially early on, there were reports of millions of animals being slaughtered early because they couldn't then fit into the supply chain properly, or would be overgrown relative to processing abilities later on down that supply chain. So I mean, we can just wholly avoid some of those issues, which I think is a benefit to the world, to say the least.
Yeah, I actually worked as a butcher for a number of years in my kind of late teens, for about 4 years. As it was my part-time job, and it was like a local butcher's. All the meat was kind of locally sourced, and when we would kind of slaughter and work with chickens, we would basically be throwing out chicken wings because Irish people don't eat chicken wings. Whereas the chicken wing in the United States is one of the most expensive parts of a chicken because chicken wings are associated with going down to the bar and watching American football, etc. Barbecue wings is culinary delicacy really in the United States. But yeah, and just purely culturally, like we would try to do stuff with the chicken wings, but nobody would buy them, and so you just ended up in the garbage, which is quite sad.
Well, as a big chicken wing fan myself, I'm especially saddened by that. The rest of the world could take a cue from America in that delicacy, I think.
100%. And because you mentioned COVID, I suppose, has COVID in any way affected your business specifically, either pro or con?
I mean, look, like everybody, we had a period of uncertainty early in the year where we weren't sure what the next phases were going to be. As a physical science company, we need to be in the lab to be, advancing the science on our front. But after we sort of figured out the setup and, had to recalibrate, we're a team of scientists, and we have attacked that problem with science. We're using masks on site, kind of increased air filtration to combat any sort of virus issues. We have staggered shifts and things like that. So certainly there's been an adjustment, but I think by virtue of us being a little bit earlier in the process and not necessarily having to answer a consumer story right now, like a lot of brands have and have suffered because of that, we, minus a couple of months of really not being all that productive in the labs, we've gotten back pretty well.
And, one of the things that comes up in, I suppose, a lot of these kind of conversations when we're thinking about, the global, I suppose, a future is the trade-off between, just less meat eating in general from a climate point of view versus alternative meat substitutions of various types. I suppose, how do you think about that trade-off of just, encouraging less meat eating as a whole versus, things like what you're working on?
Well, I think that trend is already in place, but I don't think that that's going to answer the call overall. Plus, with any of these macro to our environment, to our economy or whatever, asking the personal consumption piece to solve the problem is just never going to work. So in my view, these things have to come from the top down. And even if you get people to reduce their meat intake somewhat, global meat as a industry is about $1.4 trillion. The UN expects that to get to about 1.8 trillion by 2050. So even if you have all of the meat eaters decrease their consumption by, say, 10%, you're still going to be increasing meat consumption over the next 30 years by some several $100 billion, which is going to continue to strain the resources available for it. So, I think that's a good thing for all of us to do. I'm carnivorous and a keto eater as well. So certainly I am higher on that intake, and I've tried to cut down myself, but that's not going to solve the problem overall.
Great. And then, I suppose when I look at your kind of profile and your background, I don't see a lot of, I suppose, biotechnology in there. I suppose, how did you end up at New Age Meats?
Well, my career is definitely not a straight line. I started my early career coming out of, I went to college in Florida and really wanted to get a career in investment finance. That was just very interesting to me at the time. And I still am very intrigued by investments overall. But after working in the hedge fund space for quite some time, I was working at a fund of hedge funds, which is very much a 30,000 foot view of the market. The business of finance just definitely wasn't intriguing to me and exciting anymore, just because it's a less milestone driven business. And certainly, I got an MBA from the University of Chicago. I have a CFA charter. I did all the things I could to advance my career and expand my knowledge there. But at the end of the day, it just didn't feel like I was really accomplishing anything. So, in 2012, I moved out of that space after about 6 years and started working more directly on startups, initially with the intent to move more towards venture capital. But I really found over time that the accomplishment of doing something and the connection of helping people through my businesses definitely was much more exciting to me. So my first business was Downbeats, which is a brand of high fidelity earplugs for concerts that continues to operate. And certainly, hopefully, when concerts come back to the world, we'll be operating at a much larger scale. But that's largely automated at this point. And then I did start a healthy, fast casual restaurant that was technology enabled called Square Roots Kitchen. The focus there was really to be able to deliver healthy food for a variety of diets using technology to open up the informational disparity and provide real-time nutritional transparency, dietary filtration, all that sort of stuff. It was successful in the sense of was well received by the market. However, unfortunately, we did miss a little bit on our first location, and I did have to close that business at the end of last year. I now see that as something that as a blessing in disguise, as as a office worker target market was really the core of our audience there. Certainly would have struggled in COVID, and I empathize greatly with all the restaurateurs around the world in that this is just an impossibly hard time if indoor dining is really just not safe. And without government support, I just don't see how a lot of those businesses will be surviving upcoming. But staying in that vein, as I was looking for my next project, I'm no stranger to science. Certainly, biology is probably a newer field for me to come up on, but with the team in place, I've been able to really increase my knowledge level there. And applying a lot of those skills that I've had before, from financial acumen to operations and all the sort of business understanding about how we need to create products, get them to market, brand them, and really access consumers in a way that is exciting to them. There's a lot of overlap there, and it was a definite obvious fit for the company and myself, and it's been going exceptionally well for the last year.
Yeah, and I think it's been very interesting talking to a lot of the kind of people in the climate space. I think it's more and more people are having these circuitous kind of routes into that space. And so I suppose, if let's say I was a young person coming up in the tech world, and I want to be the next generation analog of where you've gotten to, is there any specific advice you'd give that person?
I think what I would probably advise is certainly you have to lean into your skill sets. So if you are very good at STEM and science and things like that, there's a technical route that I think is open to a lot of people. I kind of went more the generalist route myself early, which is it has its pros and cons. I think early in your career, people may view that as, well, you're a jack of all trades and master of none. I want to silo you, and especially in larger corporations. But if you are trying to get to a point where, say, I am today, having that 360-degree view and really understanding all the facets that go into business, I think is really what drives leadership at this level. So understanding how your regulatory fits in with your marketing, and how certain science levers around what we're going to need financially, but how we're going to turn those finances into a product at a price that works. There's a lot of cross-functional understanding there that's really important. So I definitely think it's you never stop learning kind of mentality is definitely what will keep driving that leadership over time.
I also think there's a lot of kind of interesting kind of cross-pollination of ideas between different domains and sectors. As I was more, when I was involved in finance, but I was more in the kind of fintech supplier of technologies and data to investment professionals like you were back in the day. And it's funny, like I now talk to a lot of people more in the kind of agriculture and food space. And when I get into the nitty-gritty, basic data models that we were using, for hedge fund, quantitative hedge funds, 10, 15 years ago, are like groundbreaking kind of, fascinating things to people in a domain or an industry that's just a little bit behind in certain areas, but not in others. But particularly around kind of digital transformation and data, I think a lot of these are a little bit behind where finance was, or
Totally
finance
agree.
is today. So I think that could also help people as people move across. Like think about the domain or the industry you're really good at, and it's like, what lessons have you learned there that would be actually kind of really powerful and new. And, as long as you can do a good job of explaining those to a new audience, I think you can do a really kind of powerful transfer of skills.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I mean, to further on that point, even I would say the one skill set that has applied in any company, career, or even conversation I've had in business overall is that there's a data-driven approach to everything, and that tends to be the one that will provide the most value, and you're going to be able to understand what's going on underneath if you're using that sort of style of approach.
Absolutely. And I suppose one last kind of general question on climate. In your view, what's the largest kind of climate problem that no one seems to be tackling?
I mean, we're all kind of polishing deck chairs on the Titanic if we're not addressing the energy portfolio, right? Like
Hmm.
it's 70% of our carbon emissions in a year, and yet somehow we're still providing subsidies. And this is America, I'm saying we're still providing subsidies to oil and gas, and not to solar and wind, which are cheaper per kilowatt hour than old school style fossil fuels. So I think there's a lot of reasons for that. That's perhaps its own podcast unto itself. But until we really start as a society putting our money behind that, and I largely mean government money, because again, if we're putting this on personal consumption, it's never going to happen, or it's going to happen so slowly as to not be effective at all. So until we as a society putting our government weight behind that, I think it's going to be tough sledding.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think about in the energy space is, we've seen this kind of cost of solar and wind get to price parity pretty quickly in this kind of 15 years of dedicated research and uses. It's probably 15 years later than we would have liked, right? Because if we had hit that parity in 1998,
Right.
maybe we would have actually been okay without having to do so many moonshots in the next 20 years to just try to not have kind of catastrophe. So, but it's this kind of interesting kind of element that like we kind of just missed the boat of getting away, having our cake and eating it too,
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I suppose just to end up then and finish up, really enjoyed this conversation. Is there anything I should have asked you about but didn't?
I actually always ask that of people. So it's a great question, but I don't think in this case that we're missing anything all that vital.
Cool. Well, I suppose the last question I'll have then is, when will we next hear about New Age Meets? What is the kind of next milestone, if there are any, that you can kind of share that that are coming on the horizon?
Ideally, we're going to be looking at a large capital raise sometime next year. Exact figures questionable, but then hopefully in the next couple of years, at some point, you'll be able to see our products at market. Hopefully in a restaurant near you, and we'll be looking forward to that day.
And I'll be up at 3 a.m. Having an all breakfast of it because it's breakfast time back home. Cheers, Derin. It's been great.
Lovely. Thank you so much.